Dear friends, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, Madame la Présidente, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome you all to the last conference of our cycle. As this event concludes the series, let me first reiterate our heartfelt thanks to our partners. First of all, at the Financial Times, Lionel Barber has expressed from the outset his interest into our project. And his remarkable colleagues have given us invaluable support as moderators, speakers, organizers. Without you, none of this would have been possible. Thank you very much. I'm also extremely grateful to the LSE, which has allowed us today to have one of its star academics at the table, Professor Lord Stern. Thank you for your presence. And let me also thank Chatham House, whose director, Robin Liblet, has been supportive all along, and whose advice and contributions have been invaluable. Also many thanks to the Institut Français, to the Franco-British Council, Madame la Présidente, which have provided critical resources when these have been lacking. Hubert Védrine, a former French foreign minister, recently wrote that the war on terror had obscured the real revolution that was taking place in world affairs, that is, the rise of emerging powers. This rise and its consequences were the main thread of our 4 previous conferences, one of them being organized, by the way, at the Financial Times headquarters on the reform of the international monetary system a couple of days after my arrival in London. It was quite a lively discussion, I must say, that we had on that day. We have focused in particular on how 2 key fora, the G8 and the G20, have adapted to the new world order and try to ensure, against the odds, a sound future for multilateralism and international cooperation. And this was illustrated in specific policy areas, from financial regulation and the international monetary system to internet development, and as well commodity price volatility. We have also highlighted the consequences on global governance of this broad power shift. London is a global stage with world-class media, institutions, individuals. Your objections, suggestions, and encouragement throughout the cycle have been fed back to the French G8 and G20 presidency in Paris. They have been invaluable to us, and I believe have informed policy. We scan the summit of the G20. Only weeks away, officials are now feverishly working on the summit's final communique. They are also grappling with current events. The G8 in Deauville was dominated by the Arab Spring and Fukushima. The economic crisis and the sovereign debt issue may well partly steal the show in Cannes. Today, we will try to step back from all this turmoil and look to the future. We will address climate change, an issue for ourselves and future generations, an issue so important that we are glad to conclude the cycle with it. I do not guarantee that you will leave this room beaming with confidence and hope, but at least we'll have tried our best. The Durban conference is approaching, and national positions remain still far apart, even after the 7 days negotiation session in Panama last week. Yesterday, the AU Environment Council adopted the conclusions defining its positions for Durban, where we hope that the AU will continue to play a leading role. The US Congress is divided, and we know that China faces a leadership renewal in March 2013. So far, the G8 has played a relatively limited role on climate change. Until recently, the G20 had played none, chiefly because of China's opposition. Only in late April did G20 Sherpas agree that the group would address climate finance. Is it enough? What is the state of play of negotiations? Is progress possible in Durban? What role should the G20, whose membership includes the major stakeholders, play? Does the current economic crisis change the picture? Can we afford to wait at all? And if we had to, what advice should we give to the UK's G8 presidency in 2013? To answer these questions, we are privileged today to have a distinguished panel from a range of professional backgrounds, academia, NGOs, business, and negotiation. So let me thank Lord Stern, whose sterling work in London is known to all. Tom Delay, a leading practitioner who leads an original organization, the Carbon Trust. David Nussbaum, who leads one of the main advocacy groups, the Worldwide Fund for Nature UK. And Paul Watkinson, head of the French climate negotiation team, who happens to be, a British citizen as well. So it's a pleasure to have this, I would say, this convergence between our two countries to produce the best experts. And before handing the floor to Lionel Barber, a few final words of appreciation to our sponsors. Without them, nothing would have been possible. Through the cycle, Eurostar has kindly transported our Parisian visitors in the greenest possible way. Mouette NC UK and La Cave à Fromage have brought us the magnificent products of the French countryside, all things that may disappear when Reims has a sub-Saharan climate and the Auvergne breeds camels. So another big thank you to our sponsors for their invaluable support. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very pleasant and useful evening, and I hope you will enjoy the discussion, and I wish all the best to our panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd just like to echo your remarks. I think we've had a very constructive partnership with the French Embassy here in London. It's been a lot more constructive than the events on the rugby field last Saturday, but I just want to say that in the spirit of the Entente Cordiale, I do wish Les Bleus the best next weekend in New Zealand. It hurts to say that, but I do. I'd also like to thank the sponsors for putting together this, helping to back this series. I think we've really contributed to the debate on very important public policy issues. And as the ambassador was saying, there is no more important than the future of climate change. And we do have an expert panel here. They need no introduction. I'm going to ask each member to speak for around 5-6 minutes. We then may have a little debate on the floor, on the panel, and then I'm going to ask the audience to join in because we do believe in interactive debate here. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Nick Stern. He was, for several years, the chief advisor to the government on economic policy, the head of the government's economic service, but of course, most notably, he was the author of the groundbreaking Stern Review on the economics of climate change. Nick.
Thank you very much, Lionel. I was a public servant for only 3.5 years, which is a bit longer than I meant to be there. I'd love to talk about the way the negotiations are going, and particularly what's happening in China, which is of great importance. But I was asked some questions, so I'm just going to try to answer the questions I was asked. How serious is the climate threat, was my first question. The answer to that is very. We're around 445 parts per million now of CO2 equivalent. We're adding 2.5 a year. That's rising. 100 years of that adds 300 or more, that takes us around 750 or so. That gives us something like a 50 chance of being above 4 degrees, 5 degrees. We can't be precise on that, but that order of magnitude. Is 4 or 5 degrees very big? It's immense. We haven't been there as a planet for about 30 million years or so. About. We can't be precise, but we humans have been around for perhaps 200,000. 5 degrees less, last ice age, very recently, 10, 11, 12,000 years ago, transformed where people could live. The ice sheets came down roughly to London, and I'm a Londoner, you'll excuse my reference point, and people lived closer to the equator than that. You could walk to France. These things change, these kinds of temperature changes change radically where we can be, change the relationship between human beings and the planet, and that could happen in 100 years or so. All these are probability distributions, but these aren't remote tails of distributions. These are 30, 40, 50% of probabilities of dramatic transformation. Yes, the climate threat is extremely serious. It's hard to imagine a more serious threat. And we're talking about effects in the lifetime of our children and grandchildren who are born now, not abstract future generations, people who are already with us. That is just taking the basic science. If you want to study the basic science, go to your National Academy of Science website, be it the French Academy, the Royal Society, the US National Academy. All this started with the wonderful French mathematician physicist Joseph Fourier in the 1820s. It's 200 years of solid science. But it's about risk management. We can't say precisely what will happen. We're managing risks. My second question is, can we afford to wait? Delay is dangerous. Why is delay dangerous? Because it's a ratchet effect. We're adding 2.5 parts per million a year, and that's rising. So if we wait for 10 or 15 years, you're talking about adding another 30, 40, 50 parts per million, taking us already to somewhere around 500 parts per million, which is the kind of concentration that gives you 40, 50% chance of a 3 degrees centigrade rise. And we haven't seen that for about 3 million years on this planet. Remember, we've been around only 200,000. So we cannot afford to wait. But where do we need to go? Well, then the questions start to become more encouraging and more exciting. We have to cut emissions per unit of output by a factor of around 8 in the next 40 years, assuming that the world economy, with good policies, grows by a factor of 3 or so in that time. We have to divide emissions per unit of output by a factor of about 8. Now, that is surely an energy industrial revolution by anybody's standards. We have to do it in about 40 years. But if you look back over waves of technological change, they're creative, they're innovative, they're full of discovery. They're full of dislocation, of course. It's creative destruction and industrial revolution. Nothing is win-win-win. But these are periods of creativity and growth. That's a very positive part of the story. Another positive part of the story, which is extremely important, is that this will give us a cleaner, quieter, safer, more biodiverse way of living. So this is a very positive story. It's a very exciting story. China, in its 12th five-year plan, I think we should talk about that later on this evening, has embarked down that road. Will it go fast enough? Grave doubts about that. Has it recognized the road? Does it want to win this industrial revolution? The answer to that is clearly yes. The last question I was asked was about the Stern Review and its conclusions, particularly at this sort of time of economic fragility. Basically, in one sentence, the argument was of the Stern Review was that inaction is much more dangerous and costly than prompt and strong action. Has that conclusion changed? It's been strengthened. The evidence that's come through in the last 5 years, emissions growing a bit faster than we thought, absorptive capacity of the planet less than we thought, particularly of the oceans, many of the things happening faster than we thought, particularly in the polar region. So the risks look bigger than we thought 5 years ago. On the other hand, the way in which technologies have changed in this 5 years, even with uncertain government policies, have been quite remarkable. The way in which the capital costs of solar have dramatically fallen. The way in which people are experimenting with nano batteries and nanotechnologies to take opposite ends of the technological spectrum, things that we know about, like solar, things that we're discovering, like nanobatteries and storage, and everything in between. Who would have thought that General Motors would be making an electric car, or that the extent of electricity generation by wind in Texas would be on the scale it is now? Who'd have thought that 5 years ago? So it's not full of disappointment these last 5 years, but they've been mostly action been much too slow and too hesitant. But we shouldn't write them off. We shouldn't say it's all been hopeless. This story of discovery, I think, is very promising. Governments can operate bad policies and make the transformation, this transition, this industrial revolution, much more costly than it needs to be. Failure to collaborate can make it more costly than it needs to be. These are dangers, but the main story of technological discovery, I think, on balance, brings the costs of action down. So I think very clearly the Stern Review's conclusions have been strengthened. Finally, if I might add, we've got one of the most important decades, I think, in human history. We've got enormous macroeconomic imbalances. I mean, let me put the hat on the ex-chief economist of the World Bank. We've got enormous macroeconomic balances. We've got debts, deficits and debts in many rich countries. We've got fragile growth. We've got still large numbers of the world in poverty. And we have to embark on this new industrial revolution. Now, my view is that actually, if you put those things together, you stand a much better chance of success on any one of them than if you pull them apart. And if we suffer from the crippling defect of only being able to think of one thing at a time, then we will fail on most of these things.
Thank you very much, Nick. I now turn to Paul Watkinson, who is the head of the French climate negotiation team. He's been a member of that team since 2000, and its head, I believe, since 2007. And most important of all, he was in Copenhagen. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, and good evening. Yes, I was in Copenhagen, and I guess that's a good place to start in discussing where we are in the international negotiations. Because people heard about Copenhagen, they had big expectations, and what they mainly heard is that Copenhagen was a failure. And compared to what we set ourselves, it probably was. It did not give us a single global agreement to tackle everything in terms of dealing with climate change, reducing emissions, setting targets, setting ourselves global ranges that we would all try to meet. But I think we had rather overly high expectations for what one single meeting could achieve, what one single process could achieve. And I think what Copenhagen did was actually very, very helpful in the longer term. It decided to start from something simpler, which is essentially an element about information, what countries are doing, the reporting, the information on the progress, an ability to review that progress. We have some horrible acronyms in our process. I'm not going to bore you with them, but it's about review, whether we call it consultation, assessment, whatever other term we use. So we know what people are doing. People say they will do something. What have they actually done? That's the first part of what we try to put in place in Copenhagen. The second part is a series of institutions by which we can try and strengthen international cooperation. And in Cancun, in December last year, we took what had been a disputed political deal in Copenhagen and tried to put it more firmly into a UN framework by a set of decisions. That's not been finished. It's work which is ongoing, and it's a matter of moving forward step by step. But I think as we move forward towards Durban in a few weeks' time, one of our main roles is to take those two strands, the information side and the institutions, and to make them real, to put in place the detailed rules around them, so that countries will report every 2 years. What sort of rules do we need to tell people what to report on? The support which will be available to help the developing countries in making that reporting, and then the rules which will allow us to have review processes at the international level to strengthen our understanding and to feed back to countries. The other part of that is the institutions. We decided to set up a green climate fund. A process is now underway to make that real, to design it, to put on place what is the governance, what sort of arrangements internally will the fund have. The final meeting of the transitional committee that we set up to do that, and bringing together mainly people from finance ministries who know how to make a fund work, not climate negotiators like me who don't. And that will meet next week in Cape Town, and we hope give us a blueprint for how to make this fund work so we can get it going after Durban. We also put in place a committee to help people exchange information on technology. How do you get access to it? Similarly, to strengthen the information and the access and share experience on adaptation to the impacts of climate change. All of that is useful. But as I say, it's a stepwise approach. Of course, it's nowhere near enough. Countries put pledges on the table in Cancun and Copenhagen. Those pledges have been captured. They're a good first step, but they're taking us nowhere near the 2 degrees that we need to limit, let alone the 1.5 degrees that many people think would be the maximum warming that we could allow. At the moment, we're probably on a track to 3 or 4 degrees. Lord Stern is probably better placed to say than I am, but it's nowhere near enough. So as we move through Durban, we have a number of things to do. I've mentioned implementing the rules, the decisions we've already taken, making those concrete, so those institutions work, those information systems will build up, and that gives us a very, very solid basis for future action. But we need to take those pledges that countries have made. And I don't want to downplay the importance of a pledge. Countries need to appropriate themselves. It needs to be a political appropriation by a country of their targets. Telling someone you're going to reduce your emissions by 20% is all fine. But them saying themselves, we put it into our national law, we implement it, this is something, we get political support at a local level, regions, cities acting on this. That's much more solid, public opinion being brought on board. That's what's needed to really make those changes. But that ambition level is not enough. So we need a process which allows us to find out ways we can build up that ambition. There are things we haven't done yet in the fields of agriculture, in the field of some of the other gases which haven't been tackled yet, aviation, maritime. But we also need to encourage countries to improve and to strengthen their own targets. There's a debate in the European Union on whether we can go beyond the 20% target towards a 30% target by 2020. That is part of that process, although that will not be resolved in Durban. It's an ongoing process, but we need a way forward on that. We need a process on how to mobilize long-term finance to assist developing countries in tackling climate change. Again, that's not going to come from all the traditional sources. We can't simply say governments in developed countries will fund that from their budgets. We know the constraints we face. That's not going to happen that way. We will have to continue the support we have been delivering, but we will have to find other ways of building up that support. We think that innovative sources of financing will have to be mobilized in that field. Market mechanisms in the field of aviation. Maritime transport is particularly interesting. Issues such as taxation of financial transactions as well, reducing subsidies which are unjustified on fossil fuels. There are many ways we can tackle them. There was a very good report a year ago from the advisory group on finance put in place by Ban Ki-moon. In the context of the G20 this year, we've launched a process with a report coming in from the World Bank and the IMF on how we can take forward some of these. And that will be looked at by finance ministers meeting in just a few days' time, and we'll also go to the Cannes meeting of heads of state at the start of November. Building up political momentum on that is crucial, and also taking that forward in a UN context is going to be important after Durban. And finally, we need to come out of Durban not with a series of single decisions, technical criteria to judge have we succeeded or not. I think the key thing is, are we building momentum towards a much stronger climate system and a climate framework over time? The building on ambition, but also we cannot stay at the level of simple political pledges by countries. We need to start converting those into legal commitments at the international level. For the moment, we have the Kyoto Protocol. We need to take a decision on how we follow up Kyoto. In France, we certainly want to continue Kyoto and pursue it and to be bound by it, but we need to put in place a parallel process to start building up a new legal framework, a stronger and broader legal framework, which will include the commitments of all parties by about 2020. Now, having that process launched in Durban is a crucial goal, and that would allow us to take forward Kyoto, to apply a second commitment period of Kyoto from January 2013, but to have a parallel process to negotiate a new legally binding arrangement for somewhere around about 2020, but which we'd have to wrap up by about 2014 or 2015. Durban is going to be honest, it's not the conference which will solve everything. It will be a series of step changes. And it will have to go through a number of other processes afterwards. But I think getting those off the mark and going in Durban will be crucial. And as I say, building up towards a stronger system over time.
Thank you very much. The inside view of the negotiations. Let me just ask a very general question, if I may. Where are we on a scale of 1 to 10 towards an acceptable deal to the main parties?
In Durban?
Yeah. Now.
You want me to answer with just one number? I mean, I'd say around about 5.
Okay, that's
People
that's
are
helpful.
talking about these middle options. The future of Kyoto is not a binary choice, yes or no. The idea of talking about a strengthening of the legal framework is on the agenda. A lot of the technical work is moving forward. It can go very wrong, but it can also go the right way. So I put it about 5.
I hate to put you on the spot there, but we'll come back to that. Good. Next. The next speaker is Mr. David Nussbaum. I'm just going to get your full CV here, right in front of me. You joined the WF UK as Chief Executive in May 2007, and before that you were the Chief Executive of Transparency International. On a personal note, I can still remember meeting a former colleague in Washington who told me that he was going to set up this NGO called, and he said, Transparency International. We're really going to expose, and my God, what you've done over those years since 1992, it's been incredible. So, personal perspective now on the topic du jour, which is the future of climate change.
Yes, thank you. And I'm still a trustee of TI UK, but here with my WWF hat on today. I was asked to look at, does the current financial turmoil fundamentally alter the situation, and then to explore a bit about the situation here in the UK. I think it's clear that the financial crisis means that that is dominating political agendas, but it doesn't mean, as Nick has told us, that the challenge of climate change has gone away. But I think it does imply that we face some pretty tough choices on climate financing, because it's very difficult to sell any idea that places additional burdens on public finances to the Treasury or Ministry of Finance in any country. But there are governments who are taking action. If we look at the Danish government's announcement last week to commit to 40% reductions by 2020 and 100% renewable heat and power by 2035, that's a signal of the kind of leadership that is possible. And we know, of course, as has already been alluded to, the degree to which China is betting on this is the future. 47% of wind last year went in China. The UK, on the other hand, is not doing so well. We're now out of the top 10 countries for investing in and installing renewable energy infrastructure. So I think in that context, it suggests that strong legislation and policy frameworks are going to be increasingly crucial, particularly to get the long-term investor confidence that will facilitate and encourage the private finance that we are going to need to get the low-carbon green economy going. Of course, that has other benefits, like reducing our exposure to fossil fuel price volatility, but the importance of clear, consistent legislation and policy frameworks can't be underestimated, in my view, and I think the G20 has an important role to play and important signals to give in that respect. Now, just looking at the UK for a moment, of course, we have some very strong advantages here, with the Climate Change Act providing, in principle, legislative certainty for businesses, investors, and indeed for politicians, and it came in with cross-party support. But political signals can undermine that certainty. And the fourth carbon budget decision was good in that it was adopted, but disappointing in that a review was mandated. And I think this comes from probably two of the most regressive departments in the UK government on this topic, BIS and the Treasury. And in fact, if you look at the EAC report, the Environmental Audit Committee report, which came out today, you'll find them highlighting this issue of the undermining of investor confidence through inconsistent statements coming from government. And you'll find some interesting quotes in the media, no doubt, tomorrow from Zach Goldsmith on that, and also from Joan Wally, the chair of the committee, who particularly cites the rather unfortunate elements of Mr. Osborne's speech at the Conservative Party conference last week. So our argument would be that political leadership is key, and that's where the G20 has a crucial role to play. What might that role be? Let me enumerate a few points. I mean, firstly, redirecting fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, it's sort of bonkers, really, isn't it, to be subsidizing fossil fuels. Of course, we may need to pay attention to those who may need help with affording to have the energy that they need. But that does not need to be provided in the form of fossil fuel subsidies. Secondly, the G20 could help in identifying innovative sources of finance which are going to be critical if we're going to unlock a deal. I think if the score is at 5, I'm not sure I'd be there.
Where would you be?
Considerably lower. In terms of getting the kind of deal the world needs at Durban. I mean, I don't want to say we can't get a lot of progress, but I don't think we're going to get the kind of deal that the climate situation that Nick Stern described merits. One of the things that will unlock a deal is getting finance on the table. That's going to be difficult from public treasuries, so it's going to have to come from innovative sources, and those include things like bunker fuels, aviation and shipping, where again clear political signals would be helpful. There's the question of a financial transaction tax, which may not do quite so much for the entente cordiale that we were referring to earlier. And then there's also looking at the tangible steps we need to have, not just rhetoric. So I think it would be great to see the G20 coming out with specifics that governments represented there are going to do, not just some nice words in the communiqué. Just a final point. One of the things the G20 looks at is issues of stability. And stability in markets, in economies, and how we ensure we have the resilience we need. And one of the threats to that is the way that if you look at financial markets today, they value fossil fuel reserves implicitly in the prices of fossil fuel companies. Those valuations assume that those fossil fuels will be burned. If all those fossil fuels are burned, the likelihood is that the temperature rise would result in significant changes to the value of other assets, and those changes are not reflected in financial markets. So we're building what we would call a carbon bubble, where the implicit value we're placing on carbon assets, fossil fuels, is inconsistent with the values we're placing on the rest of the economy, given the consequence for the economy if all that carbon in the fossil fuels was to be burned. So it would be great to see the G20 looking at the systemic risks in the current system around the issue of climate change.
Thank you very much. You fired a carbon-neutral broadside against the Chancellor and the Business Department for their lack of green enthusiasm. Let me just ask you a quick question here, which I'm sure is on the lips of all the audience. Do you think that the British government made certain pledges under Tony Blair during the good times when credit was cheap and easy, which the present coalition government is now regretting? So while Nick Stern may be right on the science, the politics have fundamentally changed.
Well, I can't speak for the current government's attitudes to Tony Blair, but I think we can all guess something of what they might be. But to address your question, I think the cross-party consensus on the need for the Climate Change Act, for climate action, was well established and lasted after the financial crisis broke, and that is reflected in the current government's policy, for example, on funding some CCS demonstration, on accepting an awful lot of the framework which was put in place. What's regrettable is to see the inconsistency in not maintaining. That is clearly the trajectory of travel, and of course we have to be cautious about committing public funds. That's why I also think we should be looking at private funds. But above all, my concern is if you don't have policy consistency and you have senior politicians wobbling on this front, it undermines investor confidence. And in the end, the most of the money for this has got to come from the private sector. And
we're going to come to that in the follow-up. Our last speaker is Tom DeLay, Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust.
Lionel, thanks very much indeed. And I'm going to draw my remarks this evening really from the experience of having worked for the last 10 years with business, both as an advisor and as a small-scale investor, looking particularly at means to accelerate the move to a low-carbon economy. I'd like to consider two things in particular, the question of timing and the question of motive, when we come on to our discussion around what the G20 might consider appropriate going forward. Just to define what a low-carbon economy might look like, it's very clear that we've got economic growth, we've got population growth. It's going to put enormous strain on the planet and our resources, be it climate change, be it water stress. At the end of the day, sustainability is a broad anchor. Building a low-carbon economy, I believe, would address most of those strains in a consistent manner. So what is a low-carbon economy? And more to the point, how would you build one if we were to start today? Well, it's a game in two halves, and the first half is all about driving efficiency into our economy at pretty much every level, from the domestic to the business, from the buildings to the transport systems and so on. Drive efficiency into what is an incredibly inefficient economy. We've built one very quickly through the Industrial Revolution. The reality is it's not fit for purpose. In a technical point of view, it's very inefficient. But driving efficiency into it is actually something that ought to make sense. There is a positive business case for energy efficiency and carbon reduction. You typically will see payback of maybe 2 years or so, and therefore you can make the investment case going forward, and it will leave you at the end of the day more competitive than you are at the beginning. So it's good in almost every possible regard. The downside, you've actually got to pay up front for it. And pretty much everything in terms of building a low-carbon economy has this downside. It's upfront payment for longer-term benefit. Energy efficiency is no different to the rest. You've actually got to pay to make savings over a number of years going forward. The second half of the game is innovation. It's driving innovation to replace many of the assets that at the moment we enjoy and we use in the economy, often without thinking about them, the energy supply systems, the networks and so on, and to bring them up to date with true innovation going forward. I'm going to pick just one example, it's renewable power, just to give a sort of sense of scale to this. At the moment, the plans for offshore wind in the UK are a technology challenge. Not impossible, I'm an engineer and this doesn't sound impossible to me, but it's challenging. The furthest out round 3 site at the moment is 285 kilometres offshore. That's broadly the equivalent of London to Cardiff. So it's an awful long way out in the middle of the North Sea. In terms of capital flows, it's very major as well. It's broadly equivalent, if we're to meet our renewables target in the UK, to building the Channel Tunnel every year for the next decade. Again, not impossible, it's been done before and it can be done again.
When was it done before?
When it's done before. Interestingly, in terms of laying down power, we laid down slightly more power, both through the dash for gas in the 90s and the dash for coal in the 70s. So it's, in terms of investment and power capacity, that's been done before. In terms of cost of all of this, the real question is it worth it? I mean, the lowest cost way of meeting our energy supply and keeping the lights on in the UK is basically driving us off gas and making a hope in future gas price forecasts that it's going to be okay. An additional maybe 15 to 25%, broadly is most people's view, would actually buy you a more sustainable energy supply system going forward. What you'd actually be getting is a contribution to climate change targets, you'd be getting security of supply, and certainly a hedge against future fossil fuel price rises, and you'd be getting all the benefits of economic growth. But again, innovation sounds great, but there's a downside. It's upfront money. Renewable power is more upfront for a longer-term benefit than almost any other form of power generation, and that's a problem. The other is that it's substitution. You're trying to bring on board something new without actually having, the attraction to the consumer of a new mobile phone. It's just something that's going to come in the background and going to cost you more. It doesn't sound compelling. So I think there are a couple of problems, and to the point you asked before, Lionel, my score will be significantly down on 5. And I think we've got a real issue of pace and momentum. I think the reality is that to the business community, Copenhagen was a disaster. It completely blew out momentum, and I think it's going to take 5 years or more to restore that. And I think if it wasn't bad enough, I think ClimateGate, frankly, really was the blow that hit many other people. It just legitimised.
Just for everybody, does everybody know what ClimateGate is? East Anglia. Oh, well, okay, fine. Where do you stand on climate? But ClimateGate, it was just made up by the media, was it?
No, it's unfortunate. But it doesn't undermine the fundamental challenge of climate change that we face in any way at all. I think Nick, I suspect
Lionel, the media asked the wrong question. If you deleted the entire published output in every subject from the University of East Anglia over the 50 years of its existence, it would make minuscule difference or zero difference to the argument on climate change. This is 200 years of science. The numbers on temperature produced by the University of East Anglia had been produced by NASA and NOAA in the United States. The media did not ask, what difference does it make to the argument?
That's right. I just wanted to make sure that we were all clear about this.
Okay.
Otherwise, it was perfect.
Good.
Okay, if I take the business pulse, it's dead in the US, it's very live in Asia, and it's kind of middling in Europe. And I think what we're seeing is that there's a real focus on the economic development challenge, the economic crisis that we face. And frankly, the win-win of doing the right thing for the environment and the economy has largely been dropped. I mean, the environment bit is just being dropped in many countries. So the real risk at the moment is that we recover from our economic downturn by building growth in an unsustainable fashion going forward and locking out essentially the opportunity that we have to build a sustainable future. I think that would be a great shame. What's more, we simply hand a competitive advantage to those countries who are not constrained in this way and who are able to invest with a longer term view, recognizing that it's right for the environment and right for the economy at one. The Carbon Trust, for what it's worth, has closed down its very small operations in the US in the last couple of weeks, and we're doubling our investment in China and Asia. Why? Because that's where it's happening. That's where all the momentum is. That's where the drive for innovation and investment is coming from. We want to be part of that to see what we can do to make a difference. The last point I'd make on government intervention, at the end of the day, everybody will say it, but I'll repeat it. I think what the business community is looking for from government in leadership is some shared political will, some real shared political will, and also access to some sort of financial structures that are an incentive to longer-term investment and not the short-term view. Most of all, we in the West now need to rediscover the case for green growth as being both the environment and business working together. Because if not, we're going to give, frankly, Asia every competitive advantage they need, if they need any more than they've already got.
Right. I'm just going to thank the panel for sticking to their allotted 5 to 6 minutes. Pretty good. Good start. 2 questions. One, finance, innovative finance, climate finance. There was what I call a killer fact we just heard, which is to meet our renewable energy targets in this country alone, you'd have to finance the equivalent of the Channel Tunnel every year. Now, Nick Stern was on the group, the advisory group on climate finance, which also included Christine Lagarde and Larry Summers. So could you just give us, in just a few sound bites, how are we going to meet those financing needs?
The question we were asked on the advisory group on finance was, how can we generate, through innovative sources of finance, flows, public and private, from rich countries to developing countries of around $100 billion a year by 2020. That corresponded to, I think it was Article 9 of the Copenhagen Accord. I, like Paul Watkinson, was in Copenhagen, and that was the bit that I was working on. The question, and I'll say how you do that, the question that Tom was raising was, how do you get the investment across the globe in this area, which is a very, very different question. I mean, 2%.
Well, we're just dealing with, let's just deal with our little island's needs, and then we'll go to the rest of the globe.
Yeah, because, well, if you take world GDP, which is probably of the order of 70 trillion, and if you take 2% of that, you've probably got 1.4 trillion. That's the kind of ballpark extra investment around the world you're trying to generate. That will mostly be private sector investment, and it will arise because of government incentives and confidence, as David was saying, in government policies. It will arise from firms anticipating where the real technical progress and opportunities are going to be, and it will arise from firms looking at just how risky high carbon investment is going to be if policy is sometime in the next 10, 15, 20 years going to move in the right direction. You wouldn't be wise to build a pure coal-fired power station in Europe or the US, and people are being extremely cautious about doing exactly that. So the kind of investment you have to generate is perfectly capable of being realized if the right kind of incentives are there and if the confidence in government policy is there. And the examples that Tom gave of coal in the 70s and the dash for gas are examples of if the right kind of incentives are there, the funding comes along. Now, the question that we were asked by, following from Copenhagen, by Ban Ki-moon was a very specific and actually much smaller question. How do we generate not $1.4 trillion a year, which is the kind of investment that we're talking about? I mean, who knows whether it's 1.1 or 1.7, but this is the kind of ballpark. Much smaller question, how do you generate $100 billion a year in flows from rich countries to poor countries as a contribution to the kind of financing the poor countries are going to have to do on that, and public and private, just as the story there. What did we say? Well, we said that perhaps a half or more of it can come from carbon taxes and auction permits, maritime and aviation, and the abolition of hydrocarbon subsidies in the rich countries. On the biggest kicker was the carbon taxes and auctioning of permits, whichever system happens to be adopted. And there we argued that 90% would be kept in the treasuries of the countries levying those taxes, and 10% would go into this fund. So there's a very strong incentives for the finance ministers of the world to do this because they get 90% of the money. Maritime and aviation, because they're essentially global taxes for a global purpose, we suggested that 50% could go into this fund, and so on. The other areas we recommended were some special funding for the international financial institutions to increase their paid-in capital by a modest amount, which would allow them to leverage lending to support investment in those sectors, to help deal with the risks by allowing them to put in political risk guarantees and policy guarantees, and so on. And the last point, which would help encourage investment in the poor countries, was carbon trading. So that was the package we put together. Christine Lagarde defended very strongly, and in my view persuasively, the financial transaction tax. Larry Summers said on the very first meeting, don't bother, it ain't going to happen.
On that low note, I'd like to ask the panel if they'd like to comment on any of Nick's observations, but also perhaps to factor in whether they believe that the disaffection or the impact of the Fukushima accident perhaps has affected our ability to meet renewable targets by 2020.
I mean, what is interesting as a result of Fukushima is obviously the German response. In moving away from nuclear, it has created a real impetus to offshore wind in Germany. And actually the UK, very much seeing itself as a natural partner in Northern Europe in developing offshore wind as a sector, is now struggling, I think, to think how indeed it can compete with Germany, given the investment flows going into that sector. So I think there is at least one example of significant investment flows going in as a result of that. Whether or not it's wholly rational is another question.
If I could add, China will build about 200 nuclear power stations around 1 gigawatt ago in the next 20 years. If some countries knock out 10 or 15, clearly it makes a difference, but set that against the 200 that China's likely to build, and that would give China perhaps 15-20% of its capacity in nuclear, if they did all that. So nuclear, from that perspective, has a role to play, but it's a minority part of any story you want to tell.
I think nuclear in the UK and indeed in Europe is completely irrelevant to 2020 renewable targets, because we won't have any new nuclear power stations functioning by 2020. You could argue it had some relevance in the 2020s, but I don't think it's relevant up to 2020. WWF did a report called the Energy Report, looking at could we get the world to 100% renewable energy by 2050. And the answer was it was pretty challenging. You could get to 95%, but it was pretty difficult to do the last 5. And that's with no new nuclear and only using existing technologies, known technologies, and deploying them. Of course, you can only do that if the first thing you go for is energy efficiency. I mean, in parallel to developing renewables, but we have to get much, much more serious about energy efficiency, rather than thinking the assumption, the answer is always predict and provide. we've got to look at how we reduce demand, and we've also got to look at interconnectivity. That's hugely important, particularly with renewables, to get proper DC cables and legal agreements to distribute energy much more efficiently and effectively.
Please.
Can I just add a brief word? And obviously, in the French point of view, nuclear remains a key part of our energy strategy, although we do have a review which is underway, and I can't anticipate on that. Obviously, that's taking us into more other debates. But I wanted to stress, I don't think it's a choice one or the other. The point is we have to look what are the low-carbon strategies we can have, and it's nuclear, it's renewable, or it's fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. I mean, we don't, and then energy efficiency, as everyone has been stressing. We don't have that many choices. And one final point. An area that we have been pushing very hard is the issue of looking at access to energy in the poorest countries. We're thinking about ourselves, but if we look at many countries, the billions of people who sadly do not have access to clean energy source or any energy sources today, modern energy sources.
About 1.5
You're talking about 1.5, even, it depends on the exact definition you're using of the boundary. That's one of the reasons we set up an initiative early this year. We call it the Paris-Nairobi Initiative for Access to Energy, which we launched with the Kenyan Prime Minister in Paris back in April, to bring parties together to really stress how we work with countries to facilitate access to clean energy. And in those countries, that means essentially renewables, because I think in Africa that's the key technology, or in some of the other poorer countries, that's crucial, island states and others, that will be crucial. They're not the ones which will really change the emission profile of the world, but if those countries move forward with old technologies, they're locking themselves into a bad development pathway, which will not ensure growth for them in the future. And they have to tackle also the impacts of climate change, which will be very, very difficult already.
Good. Thank you very much. I'm ready to now open to the floor.
I'm Simon Maxwell. I chair the Climate and Development Network, which is a large DFID, British Government and Dutch-funded initiative on climate and development. The Chief Executive, Sam Bickersteth, is also here. I have another hat, which is I work on global governance issues, and that's what I want to ask about, because it's the G20 link that is particularly challenging here and hasn't been very much discussed. The question is, can you tell us what France has been able to leverage in the way of a G20 engagement, and why have you been successful when the Koreans weren't?
Would you like to answer that on behalf of the French government?
Yeah. Well, I don't think the aim at the moment is to take the negotiations out of the UNFCCC. We remain committed to that multilateral path and taking that forward. The question is how to produce political momentum in this. And the area we decided to focus on in the context of the G20 this year was particularly the area of financing, which is clearly something where the G20 has a particular added value to bring. Yes, the US, China, if you try and say, should we do it in the UNFCCC or the G20, yes, we would move towards that sort of clash. It would be difficult. But the financing side, it's very hard for anybody to dispute the G20 can really bring added value to the debate. So that's why we decided to focus on that part. It is on the agenda for the finance ministers meeting in just a few days on the basis of the reports, the World Bank, the IMF, also a report from Bill Gates more generally on mobilizing financing for development. And those are the issues which we think those ministers and heads of state and government can really drive.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Tyndale from the Centre for European Reform. Quick comment just on the nuclear and in support of the French government position. The French government obviously is very pro-nuclear, but is doing better on wind, better on hydro, better on combined heat and power and district heating than many other countries, including the UK. So the French government has shown that you don't have to choose between nuclear and other low-carbon options. My question, however, was to Lord Stern. Nick, you said you would like to speak more about China, but hadn't been asked to address that, so I will ask you to address that. What could Europe do to encourage China to speed up its low-carbon transition?
My name is Roy Griffins. I think I'm here because I'm the Treasurer of the Franco-British Council, but I'm also Chairman of the Board of London City Airport, so representing, to some eyes, the forces of darkness. I do, however, agree with most of what the panel has said, and I think you will find that the enlightened parts of the aviation sector in the UK and France believes the same. That said, I think the balance of the panel isn't quite right. And unless you, Lionel, are such a climate change skeptic as to be Neanderthal, and I know for a fact that you're not. So
Don't think I look Neanderthal. But there we are.
So my question to the panel is, what, for example, would Nigel Lawson say if he were sitting on the panel, and why is he wrong?
We'll come to good question. Right. So do you want to take China, and then we could perhaps take the Lawson response? I'll do an imitation of Nigel Lawson in the next few minutes.
I'll find it difficult to resist responding on the Nigel Lawson question, but let me say, if you want to learn about climate science, go to the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, go to the Royal Society, go to the French Academy of Sciences, study 200 years of data. Don't go to Nigel Lawson, who did PPE. I taught PPE for a long time, and I think I know what people learn in PPE.
What do they learn?
A little bit about philosophy, a little bit about politics, and not much economics.
Lord Stern is talking about a graduate of PPE who happens to be the current Prime Minister, but there we are.
Some people go on to do MSCs at the LSE, and it's quite a good preparation for doing an MSc at the London School of Economics. They do quite well.
Right.
Now,
China.
China's 12th five-year plan is a radical change. 3 key dimensions. They're going to expand consumption relative to investment in the economy. These are the targets. Of course, achievement of the targets is a different thing. They're going to look to the quality of growth, and by that they mean moving much more to low-carbon growth, but they have great environmental issues beyond, of course, simply the climate change story, important though that is. And the third thing is innovation. Now, if you compare that with the strategy over the last 20 years or so, low-cost, high-energy manufacturing for export, heavily investment dependent, and catch-up technologies. And you think about the 3 dimensions I just described. That is radical change. You all know about it anyway, because I wrote a piece in the FT a little while ago after I was at the China Development Forum in March, where the 5-year plan was released, and I was involved a little bit in the discussions informally leading up to the plan. That is a radical change. If you look at what they are thinking about in terms of priority industries, they've got 7 industries. Some people call them the Magic 7, presumably a mistranslation of magnificent. But they are biotech, information technology, new materials, high-end manufacturing, energy efficiency, renewables, and clean tech. Those 7 industries are targeted to grow from 3% of the economy to 15% of the economy in this decade. China's economy will probably expand from roughly 6 trillion to 12, 13, 14 trillion over the decade. 15% of that, you're talking about in those industries $2 trillion. Capital output ratios of 3 or 4, you're talking about investment of $6, $7, $8 trillion in those industries over this decade. Ballpark, modest ballpark, $500 billion a year in those 7 industries. Those are all highly relevant. High-end manufacturing, the example they give is high-speed trains. Clean tech, the examples they give, electric cars. Biotech and info, obviously. China is going into low-carbon or low-carbon-related industries on a massive scale. And further, they're going into skilled industries, high-skilled industries, on a scale which we have to take notice of, strong notice of in the rich world. It's not simply that China's GDP will be the same as United States in 15 years. It probably will be. But it's the makeup. This movement out of low-cost manufacturing, which we've seen over the last couple of decades or so, is small beer relative to what we might see if these kinds of objectives are realized. Now, the record of the 5-year plans, on the whole, is that objectives are realized. Doesn't mean that this one will be. I just want to use, while I've got the mic, I was at Seoul, Simon. I chaired the B20 the day before the G20. I chaired the B20 session. There were just 4 B20 sessions on green growth. And this was a session which the Koreans have been very keen to put in. It was very well attended for big industries, people like Christophe de Margerie from Total, people right across the board. It was a very strong interest in climate change, and it was at the G20, the next day, the political heads of state G20, that they asked the finance ministers to look into the reports that we had made as the advisory group of finance. And it's that report of the finance ministers is being discussed in Paris this weekend. Trevor Manuel will be addressing them. He was a member of our advisory group on finance. He'll be speaking to them in Paris on Saturday, and he'll be chairing the technological committee that was referred to on the Green Fund. So I don't think that Seoul lost it, and I don't think the French have lost it either.
Obviously, we need a very active state investment right now, and so why do we keep hearing that this is going to have to happen through private investment? And if you are going to respond saying that it's because of
no, we'll let them respond, and then you'll find out.
Can I just put things in perspective? That
yeah,
in the
quick,
1960s,
because there are other people who want to speak.
This government funded the NHS and the welfare state with a higher debt to GDP ratio than we have today. So we can do it.
Sam Bickersteth, Chief Executive of the Climate Development Knowledge Network. The carbon price is very low, and the Kyoto renewal of the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol seems somewhat unlikely for several years. Could the panel comment on what mechanisms are out there to move us towards a meaningful carbon price? And if we're going to muddle through for several years to before there's a global deal towards 2015, what are the kind of bridges from the current Kyoto Protocol period?
Okay, thank you. Should we take this question about private finance versus state finance? I thought that states didn't have any money at the moment, but maybe I got that wrong.
I'll go. I think you're absolutely right. I think innovation typically requires public funding in the very early stages where the risks are absolutely enormous, frankly too great even for our venture capital colleagues. But pretty quickly you've got to recognize that the issue with many of the technologies we're talking about here is that to demonstrate them, let alone scale them up and deploy them, requires a massive investment in capital terms, far greater than many of the technologies that you alluded to. The other reality is it takes time. Most energy technologies have taken about 50 years to go from idea to maturity. And that we are trying to do all of this in breakneck speed because of all the issues that Nick has rightly challenged us with. So we do need to step up the innovation. We need to recognize that public sector absolutely has a contribution to make. And the reality is, we're getting out and gunned here big time. China is just one example in Asia. Korea is doing it even bigger in terms of relative proportions. So yeah, big challenge, and you're right.
Well, you're right. I would say you're right to a point. I mean, I think there's a very important role for government, and I hope my remarks were clear. I think there's an important role for government, but I don't think the primary function of government in this context is to provide the money, because the amount of money we need to go at the speed we need is so huge, there's no prospect of governments funding it. So what governments need to do is to create the policy frameworks and the legislative frameworks which will drive the investment from the private sector that's needed. Now, there may be some exceptions to that. I mean, I used to work in the venture capital industry, and sure, I think there's a role for government in facilitating investment in new technologies. But I just don't see it's plausible to envisage that governments will provide the scale of finance we need in this context.
Yes, just 2 points. One, picking up on that, and then maybe on the Kyoto and the market side. The first point is that many of us are seeking to mobilize government support and action. We are working with the National Research Agency, and then the financing which we're mobilizing through the Grand Emprunt, the big loan, and the follow-up through that. A lot of it is going into areas in similar ways. Is it enough to drive from the public sector the private financing which will need to follow up? But I think that side is important, and we will all have to think of that also in terms of industrial policy as we take this forward. It can't simply be left in a sort of hopeful way that all this will somehow happen. It will need to be driven. On the framework and what bridges from the current Kyoto to the future, the first thing is what we're working for is to continue applying Kyoto and to work for its full entry into force as we move forward after 2013. These I do not want these rules to disappear, and I will work so that they do continue. But we want to complete it, to put further rules for further mechanisms into place to take us beyond the clean development mechanism provided for by Kyoto, which allows a country in the north to get a credit from the south, but it doesn't have a net reduction in global emissions because it's a compensation mechanism. We would like to see mechanisms which mean that everybody contributes. So you get new types of mechanisms, so even the developing countries will contribute part of the reduction themselves, and then the credit will be available to use. And that's where the driver will actually be the trading system, such as the European trading system, emission trading system already, the linkages to other trading systems. We see the issue of China once again. China is now starting work on a series of pilot carbon trading systems in 5 different provinces. That's an extremely valuable news. We see Australia pushing hard to get in place a carbon law, an action which will move towards a carbon trading system. It's very difficult in the US, and I don't think we should hold out false hopes that that will change in the next couple of years. But the fact that it's difficult in the US does not mean the rest of the world is not seeking to move forward. And I think that's a key message we need to bear on this. We need to make the...
Can we just come to... We haven't really talked very much about the United States. I do recall that just over 10 years ago, I was one of 5 so-called experts invited to the White House to brief President George Bush for 2 hours ahead of his first trip to Europe. And I bear a heavy responsibility for the events. At least of the influence over the direction of American foreign policy. But the one thing I remember many things about this extraordinary conversation with the President and the Vice President and Colin Powell and others present. But I remember there was a brief allusion to the Kyoto Protocol. And I recall the President saying, and I'll try to do the accent right, that Kyoto was mush. That's mush in English. Now, he was also talking, of course, the fact that the Senate overwhelmingly, I think it was 96-0, voted against ratifying. 97, sorry, I was 1 vote out.
It was never formally presented.
Well, yes, but I think that testifies to a certain... I think it testifies to a certain reticence, shall we say. And so we're not just talking about maybe in 2 years' time things will change. I mean, the Americans are fundamentally skeptical about a multilateral treaty on climate change. So how are you going to get around that?
Yeah, can I try that?
Yeah, why not? You can do it in a Texas accent or an English accent.
I will try English. Although in the United States, trying to be persuasive in an English accent is not easy. I've testified 3 times to Congress, so I can have some experience. The basic issues at stake here in multilateral discussions are confidence in what others are doing. Where does that confidence come from? Now, if you take China's 5-year plan, which embodies the Copenhagen and Cancun numbers of a 40 to 45% reduction in emissions per unit of output, 2005 to 2020. The Chinese 5-year plan becomes law in China, and it becomes the achievement of the plan becomes the test by which the Chinese leadership, and in particular the presidential leadership, is judged. So where does one get confidence about where China is going? I think in this context, by looking at Chinese commitment and Chinese law, not a signature on Kyoto. Canada signed Kyoto. What difference did it make? If you look at the European Union commitment, I think the 20% is a serious European commitment. It is embodied in European law, and if it moved to 30%, I think we ought to take that seriously. No 100% confidences in anything, of course, but where does the degree of confidence come from? It comes from understanding the structure of a country, the kind of politics it follows, what determines the kind of policy commitments it makes and whether or not they'll be delivered on. If you now look at the United States, roughly half of the GNP of the United States is created in cities and states which have quite strong quite strong climate policies relative to the federal level. You have to look at the political structures, economic policy frameworks, technologies, societies of the countries that you're discussing with. Now, where does that leave international agreements? I think that you're more likely to make a commitment in the context of an international discussion. I'm not getting hung up on the meaning of legally binding, but I do not think that either the United States or China would have made the commitments they made in Copenhagen and Cancun in the absence of Copenhagen and Cancun. In China's case, they made those commitments. I wish they'd been a little bigger. In fact, I wish they'd been more than a little bigger. But they made those commitments, and they're now embodied in the story. This is a top-down, bottom-up process which requires understanding of other people's economies and societies and politics, where the top-down and the bottom-up reinforce each other. But the outcome for those taking their decisions in bottom-up, in a country or a firm or a state or a village, is where you think the overall story is going. And I do think, and I think there's evidence from, as I just described, I do think the international negotiation picture is an important determinant of where people, say, village, firm, city, whatever, it's a determinant of what they think and the investments that they make.
And just before we move to David, just to clarify this point, the point that our mutual friend Mr. Martin Wolf makes about the difficulties of persuading the developing countries, not just China, that they are not going to be penalized just as they are moving through this period of industrialization, and that essentially the West is holding them back.
Absolutely key to this story is understanding the relationship between growth and climate responsibility. If these are set against each other as an artificial horse race, then climate responsibility will lose. That's why the green growth, I don't like the language very much, but that's why green growth or the new industrial revolution, seeing this as the growth opportunity, seeing that an attempt at high carbon growth will destroy itself through the very hostile environment it will create. We have to see this as the growth story. If you're going to get 1.5 billion people with electricity supply, decentralized solar is going to be a very powerful part of that story. If you're looking at climate resilience, then low-till agriculture will be very important in that story. It releases less carbon, it makes you stronger. We have to look at the ways in which adaptation, mitigation, development, poverty reduction work together. And there's a very powerful story to be told. If you take the very crude view that a little bit of extra cost now is going to destroy your growth prospects, you're making a very grave mistake. And I fear that sometimes, indeed all too often, that's the language people use. They don't look at the co-benefits in terms of clean and safe and biodiverse, and they don't look at the intense learning processes that take place in an industrial revolution.
Okay. David?
So one way of looking at the what was Copenhagen and what do we now face is that the model that the world was approaching Copenhagen with was, we're going to create this huge roof supported by a few pillars as a global deal. And then once we've got that roof in place, we'll build all the details underneath it that we need to have the full works operating. And I think what is clear now, regrettable or not, I just think it's a reality, is that we are going to have to find ways of building a lot of the different components, the trust, the business, the financial transfers and so on, and it'll only be when a lot of that is in place that countries will be prepared to start constructing some kind of overall roof that covers it all with an international legal agreement.
So it's a compound.
I'm not sure that was quite the analogy I was looking for.
All right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think in this discussion there is very much an assumption that we can create the framework. And I look at it and think we'd never have built the internet. Why do we think we can create the framework? There's a silent voice at the moment in this discussion. It's that of the consumer. And if you look at the US, the consumer is actually far more enlightened than much of the US's federal policy, and is starting to drive some real change in business in the US, slowly, but nevertheless it's happening. I think perhaps more interesting is that that's being picked up in China. because, of course, if you look on a consumption basis at emissions rather than on a production basis, Chinese export of emissions to the US for consumption are very, very significant indeed. And one of the things that I was tickled pink by, I mean, one of the things we've sort of led is the carbon footprinting of products and services, actually working out what the carbon embodied in a good is. And we ended up doing this at the request of the Chinese government for NDRC, who developed the 5-year plan. They just asked us to go out there and pick on, a dozen or so products in China that were going to be exported, and just report back quietly on what the impact is of the Chinese grid emission factors and so on the carbon embodied in those products for export. I just think it's incredibly enlightened, and it reflects the fact that the consumer might be a silent voice in the US, at least at the moment, but actually...
So give us some details of the list, and I'll come to that question.
Lee Scott, 3 years ago, Lee Scott of Walmart set a new policy for Walmart because he thought it was the right thing to do in part, but also under pressure from consumers. He went to China, he spoke to 1,000 people, 1,000 firms in his supply chain, and he said that we're under pressure to go much cleaner and much lower carbon. You are our suppliers, we expect that from you, we know where you are, we know what you're doing, and that's something that you've got to deliver.
So what were the top products on the list?
They were actually a fairly random set, from white goods through to building materials. We just picked a random set, clothing. Okay. Various things for export from China.
Bob Watson, Chief Scientific Advisor at DEFRA, former chair of the IPCC, and also work at the University of East Anglia. I would love to be as optimistic as this panel, but I can't be. If you actually look at even the UK, it looks like we're doing a wonderful job. Domestic emissions are down 21%. But if we take into account embedded carbon, that is import-export, we're actually plus 12%. And I would guess the US is even worse than it looks, and most of Europe is worse than it looks. So let's be quite candid. We're not doing what we need to do in the UK. If you then look what's happening in the US, etc., I would like to ask the panel members, does any one of you believe we've got a hope in hell of getting near 2 degrees Celsius? I would argue we're on a pathway to 4 to 5, and we should start to get ready to adapt to 4 to 5. And is it time we are honest with the public that the 2 degrees Celsius target is rhetoric, no chance of action?
All right. Would you like to take the 2%? 2 degrees? 2 degrees, sorry.
I mean, I think the risk is, I think, first of all, the point about embedded carbon is fascinating, but we haven't got time to get into that. But it is a wonderful way of seeing things, and we certainly need to understand that further. Can we really reach 2 degrees? If we start off by saying we can't, we're certainly not going to get there. And I think that's the starting point for all of our thinking. Saying we will get there because we think we will is not enough. So the question is, how can we really build up that strategy? And I think it comes down to this balance between a top-down view, setting ourselves that ambition, and then seeking the ways of building that up through international cooperation, through the clarity, through the understanding of what our partners are doing. Just to touch on China, this point about China being a producer and a developer of clean goods and services, and that will increasingly be the case, which will affect actually the embedded carbon over time. They will actually want us to have stronger and tighter policies because it will drive their growth and their exports. So there are ways we can build up positive feedbacks in the system rather than just negative. I'm not saying that's enough by any means. I daren't say whether I am optimistic or pessimistic about it. But I think if we're pessimistic and we say we just need to do adaptation or even geoengineering, then we are killing the ability to drive more ambition in the process. So we have to find a way of keeping that pressure on.
Bob, there's a big difference between a description of what could be done and why it's attractive and a prediction that it will be done. I think the first is a necessary condition, but far from sufficient for the second. I am optimistic about the picture that we can describe of what is possible. And I'm convinced by that picture. It's a very attractive story. It involves strong investment. It's not win-win-win. It involves dislocation. It involves change. But it's a very attractive path. That's where you have to start. Because if you haven't got that story, why would anybody take you seriously? The next step, of course, is try to build the action. It is very difficult, but and I'm not predicting which way it will fall. Adaptation to 2 degrees is going to have to be major. That's the kind of thing you work on, right? 2 degrees. 3 degrees would be much bigger than major squared or whatever it is. 4 and 5 degrees, it's very hard to see what we will do. Remember, 4 or 5 degrees down, we've seen very recently, 10, 11,000 years ago. People could not live where they live now because the ice sheets came down to London. 4 or 5 degrees rewrites where people can be. Hundreds of millions, we don't know exactly, possibly billions of people would have to move. If history is any guide, we've never seen anything like movement on that scale. But when millions of people move, you get conflict. When hundreds of millions of people move, you're going to get extended and severe conflict. This is not fancy stuff. It is simply looking at the probabilities of these kinds of change. Now, if Bangladesh is underwater and the people swim, that's adaptation. You know? If southern France becomes like the Sahara Desert, as it might well be under these kinds of changes, people will move northwards. These are the kinds of adaptations which will take place. Of course, we have to think about how you adapt to 2 and 3 degrees. We're going to have to adapt to at least 2. I share your probably more. Yeah. Okay. So we have to think about that.
All right. The last 2 speakers, and then.
3 degrees adaptation.
I think that the concept of embedded carbon is important because it helps us to understand drivers, and I think from a business perspective, looking at your supply chain and where do things come from is helpful. Just to flag up, we have to think not only about carbon, there are other big issues like water, embedded water. You know, the cotton in the shirt I'm wearing consumed an awful lot of water, not in this country, but where the cotton was grown, and it's possible to do sums on that. A beef burger uses huge quantities of water, for example. So I think looking at and understanding supply chains in that way is very helpful and actually can help businesses drive efficiencies. In terms of where we're at, and Bob, your question, well, I agree with Nick's comments, and I just add this, that maybe you have a point in saying it might be helpful to us to start facing up to what would adaptation to 4 degrees look like. What costs would it impose on us? What kind of societies would we have in order to help us decide that we are going to take the action that we still can take to keep it to 2 degrees?
Okay. Tom, you've got the last word.
Yeah, I'm more of an optimist than you, Bob. On the premise that the man in the street gets it and understands it and starts voting on the basis of, I support this. Business will respond very positively, and the ingenuity of the engineers and scientists in businesses will bring costs down, and I think that will be enormous. And I think political support will very much kick in at that point. Having said that, there are some real challenges at the moment, and I think we are going nowhere in a hurry.
So, cautious pessimism all round on the panel.
Optimism about what's possible.
Yeah. Optimism what's possible. Need to shift some of the terms of debate. We've had a fascinating discussion, I think, certainly very informed. I've learnt a lot, not least that I'm not a Neanderthal, just a moderator. So could you join me in thanking the panel and thanking the embassy?